The silvered contrails of the B-17 bombers had barely faded from the sky over Dresden when the first reports began filtering back to Allied headquarters. The mission had achieved its primary objectives: railway marshalling yards destroyed, transportation infrastructure severely damaged, but at a terrible cost. The combined British night raid and American daylight bombing had transformed much of the historic city into an inferno that would burn for days. And now the surviving bomber crews faced the long, dangerous journey home across enemy territory, still bristling with defenses. In the cramped navigator's compartment of the lead B-17, Captain William Stevenson plotted their course with blood-stained fingers. A piece of flak had torn through the plexiglass nose just moments after bombs away, killing the bombardier instantly and leaving Stevenson with a jagged gash across his left palm. He pressed on, calculating headings and checkpoints with the mechanical precision that had earned him the nickname Clockwork among his squadron mates. "How's it looking, Clock?" asked pilot James Harker, his voice strained with the effort of wrestling the damaged controls. "If we maintain current airspeed and heading, we should cross friendly lines in approximately 2 hours and 17 minutes, Stevenson replied, his Tennessee drawl at odds with his mathematical precision. "Provided, of course, that the Luftwaffe doesn't have other ideas." Harker nodded grimly. Intelligence briefings had warned that German fighter controllers were becoming increasingly adept at concentrating their dwindling resources at critical points along the bomber return routes. The Germans might be losing the war, but their fighter pilots remained among the most skilled and determined in the world. A veteran Luftwaffe pilot with hundreds of combat hours could still wreak havoc on a formation of damaged bombers. "Any word from our little friends?" Harker asked, using the affectionate term bomber crews had adopted for their fighter escorts. Stevenson shook his head. "Last radio check put the nearest P-51 group 30 miles northeast. They're spread thin today with the size of the raid." The interphone crackled with the voice of Sergeant Maxwell from the top turret. "Captain, our number 2 bomber is falling back. Looks like they've lost an engine." Harker peered out the side window at the B-17 flying off their right wing. Black smoke streamed from its inboard engine, and the aircraft was visibly struggling to maintain altitude. One by one, the reality of their situation became clear. This wasn't just a single straggler. Their entire section of the bomber stream had been badly mauled over the target. "How many ships are still with us, Max?" Harker called into his throat microphone. After a moment's pause, the sergeant responded, "I count 11 plus us, sir, all showing battle damage. The Lucky Lady is flying on 2 engines. Heavenly Body has a hole in her right wing you could drive a truck through. And I think Mama's Boy has wounded aboard. They've got the Red Cross flag visible in the waist window. 12 bombers, each carrying 9 or 10 men. Over 100 airmen, all depending on the thin aluminum skin of their damaged aircraft and the protective cover of fighters that were nowhere to be seen." The mathematical odds began to calculate themselves in Harker's mind, and the resulting equation was grim. "Clock, find us an alternate route home," he ordered, "something less predictable, even if it adds flying time. I don't like the idea of following the exact course every other bomber stream has taken this month." As Stevenson bent over his charts, the radio operator's voice broke in. "Captain, flash message from Group. Luftwaffe fighters reported airborne from fields near Leipzig and Erfurt. Estimated 30-plus bandits moving to intercept returning bomber streams." Harker's mouth went dry. 30 German fighters against their 12 damaged bombers. Without fighter escort, the mathematics of survival became even more impossible. "Any update on our fighter support?" he asked, already knowing the answer. "Negative, sir. All P-51 groups are committed elsewhere or reaching bingo fuel." Harker looked out at the vast sky, empty now except for his struggling formation. Somewhere out there, German controllers were vectoring their fighters toward what would appear to be easy prey. The final act was about to begin, and the curtain would fall in blood and fire. What none of them knew was that 40 miles to the east, Lieutenant Thomas Blackwood was making a decision that would alter the deadly calculus of their survival. Lieutenant Thomas Blackwood had always been different from the other pilots in the 355th Fighter Group. While they pored over gun camera footage counting victories or competed for the attention of English girls in village pubs, Blackwood spent his evenings with the ground crews, absorbing their practical wisdom about the machines that carried them all into battle. Master Sergeant Walter Kincaid, the crew chief responsible for Blackwood's P-51, initially mistook the pilot's interest for mistrust. "Look, Lieutenant," he'd said during their first meeting, "I've been keeping these birds flying since before you got your wings. If there's something specific you're worried about—" "I'm not checking up on you, Sergeant," Blackwood had interrupted with an easy smile. "I'm learning from you. There's a difference." That distinction became clear as days turned into weeks, and Blackwood continued to appear in the hardstands and maintenance hangars during his off-duty hours. He didn't just watch the mechanics work. He asked questions that revealed a genuine understanding of aircraft systems. He took notes. He crawled into access panels alongside enlisted men who initially regarded him with suspicion, but gradually came to respect his sincere interest. "Never seen an officer get his hands that dirty without being ordered to," Kincaid remarked to another crew chief, as they watched Blackwood help troubleshoot a fuel pressure problem in bitter December weather. "Heard he was studying engineering before the war," the other man replied. "Guess some habits die hard." What began as professional curiosity evolved into something deeper as Blackwood accumulated combat missions. With each sortie over enemy territory, his theoretical knowledge merged with practical experience. He didn't just understand fuel consumption charts, he felt the difference between running lean at 25,000 feet and the rich mixture needed for maximum power during combat. He didn't just memorize emergency procedures, he mentally rehearsed them until they became instinct. By his 20th mission, Blackwood had developed a reputation throughout the group. Pilots with technical questions sought him out. Intelligence officers consulted him on the performance limitations of German aircraft. Even the squadron commander occasionally deferred to his expertise during mission planning. "The Germans operate their Messerschmitts differently than our technical manuals suggest," Blackwood explained during one pre-mission briefing. "Their supercharger settings are more conservative at high altitude to preserve engine life. That means they'll have less power than calculated above 23,000 feet, especially if they've been running at military power for more than 15 minutes. "And how exactly do you know that, Lieutenant?" asked a skeptical operations officer. "I asked our intelligence guys for the interrogation reports from captured Luftwaffe ground crews," Blackwood replied simply. "Their maintenance directives tell a different story than our performance estimates." This relentless pursuit of technical knowledge might have remained merely an interesting personality quirk if not for the events of February 15, 1945. On that day, Blackwood's understanding of aircraft systems, both American and German, would transform from academic interest to survival imperative. The mission briefing that morning had filled him with unease. Not because of the target, Dresden had already been hit hard the previous night and day, but because of the return route planned for the bombers. It violated several principles that Blackwood had come to regard as essential for survival over hostile territory. "They're bringing them back too close to known fighter bases," he muttered to his wingman, Lieutenant Michael Donovan, as they walked toward their aircraft. "And the route is too predictable. Same corridor the fortresses have used 3 times this month." Donovan, a former college football player from Massachusetts, with an easygoing manner that belied his deadly skill in the air, had learned to trust Blackwood's instincts. "Think the Germans will be waiting?" he asked. Blackwood nodded grimly. "If I were them, I'd concentrate everything I had left at the choke point near Leipzig, catch the bombers when they're lowest on ammunition, and farthest from fighter support." "Well, that's why we're going along, isn't it? To keep the bad guys off their tails." But Blackwood wasn't reassured. 4 P-51s against what could be an entire group of Luftwaffe fighters. The mathematics didn't add up to survival, let alone success. As he settled into the cockpit of Oklahoma Tornado, he ran his pre-flight checks with even more than his usual thoroughness. His fingers lingered for an extra moment on the fuel selector valve and the emergency dump system, components that he had studied more deeply than most pilots ever would. 3 months earlier, during a conversation with a maintenance officer, Blackwood had learned something interesting about the P-51's fuel dump system. "It's not just for emergencies, you know," the officer had explained. "Ferry pilots use it when they need to bring an overweight aircraft in for landing. Quite controllable, really. You can meter the flow by adjusting the valve position." "Doesn't that create a fire hazard?" Blackwood had asked. "Not as much as you'd think. The fuel atomizes so quickly in the slipstream that it creates more of a vapor trail than a liquid stream. Visible for miles, though, especially in cold, clear air. Looks like the aircraft is hemorrhaging fuel." That conversation had seemed merely interesting at the time. Now, as Blackwood prepared for what might be the most challenging mission of his tour, the information took on new significance, a puzzle piece that his mind stored away for potential use. As his Merlin engine roared to life, vibrating through the airframe, Blackwood felt the familiar pre-mission convergence of focus. The technical details, tactical analyses, and strategic considerations all faded into the background. What remained was a clarity of purpose and an openness to possibility that had served him well in 31 previous combat missions. He had no way of knowing that this 32nd mission would require every ounce of that clarity and test the limits of his understanding in ways he could not yet imagine. The rendezvous with the returning bomber stream occurred precisely on schedule, a testament to the precision of American air operations even in the chaos of strategic bombing. Blackwood's flight of 4 Mustangs arrived at the designated checkpoint just as the lead elements of the bomber formation appeared on the horizon. Through his canopy, Blackwood could see immediately that something was wrong. What should have been a tight defensive formation was instead a scattered stream of aircraft, many showing visible damage. Smoke trailed from engines. Gun turrets hung at odd angles. The signature precision of American bomber tactics had deteriorated into what appeared to be simple survival. "Coyote 3 to Coyote Leader," he radioed to Colonel Jones. "The bomber formation is significantly degraded. Request permission to provide close support to trailing elements." "Negative, Coyote 3, came the immediate reply. "Maintain assigned coverage sectors. We're stretched thin enough as it is." Blackwood understood the colonel's reasoning. Each fighter group had responsibility for specific sections of the massive bomber stream returning from Dresden. Deviating from those assignments would create gaps in the defensive screen, potentially exposing other bombers to attack. But as he scanned the struggling aircraft below him, Blackwood's tactical assessment told a different story. The trailing bombers, 12 that had fallen well behind the main formation, were the ones most likely to be singled out by German fighters, and his 4 Mustangs were the only defense they had. For several minutes, Blackwood followed his orders, flying the assigned patrol pattern above the main bomber formation. His eyes continuously scanned the horizon for the enemy fighters that intelligence had warned would be hunting. The skies remained empty except for the American bombers and their too few escorts. Then, at 14:23 hours, everything changed. "Coyote 3 to all Coyote elements," Blackwood called into his radio. "Bandits, 3 o'clock high, multiple aircraft approaching from the east." Through his telescopic gun sight, Blackwood could make out the distinctive silhouettes of Messerschmitt Bf-109Ns, at least a dozen of them, formed up in combat pairs and moving with the deliberate precision of experienced predators. They were positioning for a classic attack, high side pass with the sun at their backs, targeting the most vulnerable section of the bomber stream. Blackwood's mind raced through the tactical options, calculating angles, energy states, and probabilities with the same precision that had made him an expert engineer before the war. The mathematics were unforgiving. 4 Mustangs against 12 or more Messerschmitts, with the lives of more than 90 bomber crewmen hanging in the balance. Conventional tactics dictated that they climb to meet the threat, using the Mustang's superior high-altitude performance to break up the German formation before it could organize its attack on the bombers. But Blackwood knew that such an approach would, at best, delay the inevitable. The Germans had the advantage of numbers and position. A direct confrontation would end with his flight destroyed and the bombers unprotected. As Colonel Jones began issuing standard tactical orders, something clicked in Blackwood's mind, a connection between seemingly unrelated pieces of information that suddenly formed a coherent alternative. He knew from intelligence briefings that German fighter units were critically short on fuel. The synthetic gasoline produced from coal by the Third Reich's desperate industrial base was strictly rationed, limiting training time and combat endurance. He knew from studying captured documents that Luftwaffe pilots were under enormous pressure to achieve victories, with promotions, leaves, and even basic rations tied to success in the air. He knew from conversations with bomber crews that German fighters had become increasingly reluctant to press attacks against formations with strong fighter escort, preferring instead to wait until escort fighters had departed or focus on isolated stragglers. And he knew from that conversation months ago exactly how the P-51's fuel dump system could create a highly visible vapor trail that, to observers, was indistinguishable from catastrophic fuel system damage. All of these separate facts suddenly aligned into a tactical possibility that no training manual had ever contemplated. It was unorthodox, unauthorized, and potentially suicidal, but it might just work. Coyote 3 to 3-4 Eindhoven, Blackwood said, addressing Lieutenant Donovan on their squadron frequency. Mike, stay on my wing no matter what. When I break formation, follow me exactly. Do what I do, no questions. He could almost hear the confusion in Donovan's voice. Copy that, but the colonel said, Trust me on this one, Blackwood interrupted. It's all about fuel and psychology. Without further explanation, Blackwood waited until the German formation had committed to its attack vector. Then, at the precise moment when they would be fully focused on their approach, he executed a maneuver that must have appeared either insane or desperate to anyone watching. Banking sharply away from the bomber formation, he climbed directly toward the attacking German fighters as if attempting a head-on intercept. But before reaching engagement range, he suddenly rolled inverted, pulled through a split S maneuver, and descended rapidly away from the combat area, trailing a spectacular plume of vaporized aviation fuel from his deliberately activated dump valve. To the German pilots, the scene would have been unmistakable. An American fighter with catastrophic battle damage fleeing the combat zone. Even more enticing, a second Mustang, Donovan, following Blackwood's instructions precisely, stayed with the crippled aircraft, creating the impression of a wingman loyally escorting his stricken leader home. It was a scene calculated to trigger the predatory instincts of Theater pilots who were under immense pressure to score victories. Two damaged Mustangs, separated from their formation, represented exactly the kind of opportunity that German pilots had been trained to exploit. The gamble worked with a precision that even Blackwood hadn't dared to hope for. The lead elements of the German formation immediately altered course, banking toward what appeared to be easy kills. Within moments, the entire Luftwaffe contingent had abandoned its original attack run on the bombers and was in pursuit of the seemingly vulnerable American fighters. They're taking the bait? Donovan's voice was tight with tension. All of them, Tom. What now? Now we give them a good chase, Blackwood replied, his voice calm despite the enormous risk they'd undertaken. Far enough to keep them away from the bombers, but not so far that they give up. It's a balance. What followed was a master class in aerial deception. Blackwood maintained just enough power to stay airborne, occasionally allowing his aircraft to shudder or slip as if fighting for control. He kept his heading away from the bomber stream, but varied his altitude unpredictably, preventing the Germans from setting up a coordinated attack. Donovan followed suit, occasionally breaking formation as if struggling to stay with his wounded leader. The German pilots, sensing imminent victory, spread out to approach from multiple angles. "They're setting up to bracket us," Donovan warned, his voice tight. "Two coming in from 10 o'clock. Let them get close," Blackwood instructed. "When I call now, we both firewall the throttles and brake hard right. They won't be expecting damaged aircraft to maneuver that aggressively." As the lead Messerschmitts closed to firing range, Blackwood watched their positions with the calculating eye of a mathematician. When they committed to their firing solution, he made his move. Now! Both Mustangs suddenly surged with full power, banking hard into a tight turn that no truly damaged aircraft could have executed. The German pilots, caught completely by surprise, overshot their targets. One Messerschmitt, pulling too hard to correct, entered an unrecoverable spin and plummeted toward the ground 7,000 feet below. The remaining Germans regrouped quickly, but now their tactical calculus had changed. These were not crippled aircraft, but fully functional Mustangs employing an elaborate deception. Several of the more cautious pilots immediately broke off, unwilling to engage in a fair fight where their numerical advantage had been reduced. But others pressed the attack, their frustration at being deceived overriding tactical judgment. For the next 20 minutes, Blackwood and Donovan engaged in a running battle, always maintaining enough distance from the bomber stream to keep the Germans focused on them rather than their original targets. Fuel state critical, Donovan reported, after 15 minutes of high-speed maneuvering, down to 30 minutes at current power settings. Blackwood checked his own gauges. The deliberate dump, combined with combat power settings, had left him in an equally precarious position. They would never make it back to England. Their only hope was to reach Allied-controlled territory in France. Start working west, he instructed. Gradually, like we're trying to make it home despite damage. Let them follow as long as they can. For another 10 minutes, the deadly ballet continued, with the American pilots executing a fighting withdrawal that led the Germans further and further from the bomber stream. Finally, as the German fighters reached their own fuel limits, they broke off pursuit and turned back toward their bases. "They're going home," Donovan reported, relief evident in his voice. "We did it, Tom. We actually did it." Blackwood allowed himself a moment of satisfaction before confronting their new reality. "We're still in trouble, Mike. Not enough fuel to get home. We'll have to divert to the emergency strip at Rams." As they turned west, both pilots were sobered by the realization of what their improvised tactic had cost them. They had saved the bombers, but in doing so had sacrificed their ability to return to England. And they had directly disobeyed orders, an offense that could result in court-martial under wartime regulations. "Do you think it was worth it?" Donovan asked quietly as they set course for France. Blackwood thought of the 12 bombers and their crews, men who would now have a fighting chance to return home because of what they had done. "Ask me again when we know if those boys made it back," he replied. The fates of 2 young fighter pilots and 96 bomber crewmen had been linked by a desperate gamble. Whether that gamble would be judged a stroke of genius or an act of insubordination remained to be seen. But in the immediate calculus of survival, Blackwood knew they had altered the mathematical odds in favor of the greater number, and sometimes in war that was the best you could do. The 12 B-17s of what was now being called the Lucky Dozen approached the English coast as the winter sun began its early descent toward the horizon. The bomber crews, many wounded and all exhausted from the grueling mission, allowed themselves to believe for the first time that they might actually survive the day. Captain James Harker keyed his interphone. "Navigator, get a fix on our position. Let's make sure we're lined up for the right base." "Already done, Captain," replied Stevenson, his mechanical precision undiminished by the day's events. "We're 23 miles east-southeast of Lowestoft, on correct heading for RAF Kimballton. Estimated time of arrival 1700 hours exactly." Harker smiled despite his exhaustion. "Clockwork indeed." "Pilot to crew," he announced. "We're over friendly territory now?" "We've made it, boys." A ragged cheer came over the interphone, quickly followed by more professional status reports from each position. They had survived, but the aircraft was badly damaged. 2 engines operating at reduced power, hydraulics compromised, and more flak holes than anyone cared to count. "Still don't understand it," muttered the co-pilot, Lieutenant Frank Gorman. "HQ said there were at least a dozen 109ths patrolling this sector. We should have been bounced for sure." Harker nodded thoughtfully. Seems like someone up there was looking out for us." In the radio compartment, Sergeant Jenkins had been monitoring the combat frequencies throughout the return journey. "Sir, I picked up some chatter about 2 Mustangs that broke formation and drew off a German fighter group. Lots of confusion about it. Sounds like they led the Jerries on a wild chase away from our route." 2 fighters against a dozen? Gorman sounded incredulous. "That's either the bravest or craziest thing I've ever heard." "Maybe both," Harker replied quietly. One by one, the bombers of the Lucky Dozen reached their bases across East Anglia, fuel tanks nearly empty, hydraulics failing, and in several cases, landing gear that had to be cranked down manually. But they made it. Of the 96 airmen who had departed that morning, 93 returned alive. 2 gunners had been killed over the target, and 1 navigator succumbed to wounds during the return flight. By Bomber Command standards, it was a miracle. As night fell across England, the details of what had happened began to emerge through the disjointed reports of different bomber crews and fighter pilots. 2 P-51 pilots had broken formation, apparently trailing fuel or smoke. German fighters that should have attacked the vulnerable bombers had instead pursued these aircraft eastward. The Mustangs had not been seen again. At 8th Air Force Headquarters, the initial reaction was confusion followed by growing concern. 2 valuable fighters and their pilots missing, possibly in violation of direct orders. An investigation was immediately launched. Radio reports later confirmed that 2 American fighters had landed safely at an emergency airfield near Reims, their fuel tanks nearly empty. The pilots, Lieutenants Blackwood and Donovan of the 305th Fighter Group, reported by telephone to their commanding officer. Colonel Wilfred Jones's initial reaction was fury. "You deliberately disobeyed a direct order," he shouted into the field telephone. "You abandoned your assigned bomber escort duties in the middle of a combat mission. Give me one good reason why I shouldn't have you both court-martialed the moment you set foot back on this base." On the other end of the line, Blackwood's voice remained calm. "Sir, we identified a tactical opportunity to draw enemy fighters away from the bombers by simulating battle damage. The tactic was successful. The German formation pursued us instead of attacking their primary targets." "Simulating battle damage? What the hell does that mean, Lieutenant?" "I activated my fuel dump system to create the appearance of a major fuel leak, sir." Lieutenant Donovan followed suit. "The Germans perceived us as crippled and pursued what they thought were easy kills." There was a long silence on the line as Colonel Jones processed this information. "You deliberately dumped fuel in combat conditions?" he finally asked, his voice a mix of disbelief and reluctant admiration. "Do you have any idea how many regulations that violates?" "Yes, sir. At least 7 that I'm aware of, but it saved those bombers. The German fighters followed us for nearly 30 minutes, by which time the bombers were approaching the channel. We confirmed from French resistance reports that the Germans landed back at their bases too late to reorganize for a second interception." Another long silence. "We'll discuss this further when you return to base, Lieutenant," Jones finally said. "In the meantime, I'm receiving reports from bomber groups. Every single aircraft from the trailing formation made it home. 93 men alive who probably shouldn't be. Whatever else happens, remember that." The line went dead, leaving Blackwood and Donovan to contemplate the consequences of their actions. They had saved lives, but at what professional cost? 3 days later, Blackwood and Donovan returned to their squadron, hitching rides on transport aircraft and expecting to face disciplinary action upon arrival. Instead, they found a reception committee waiting on the tarmac. Not military police, but bomber crewmen from the Lucky Dozen. Captain James Harker stepped forward as Blackwood climbed down from the transport. "Lieutenant Blackwood, I'm Captain Harker, pilot of Carolina Sweetheart. My crew and I wanted to thank you personally." Blackwood, uncomfortable with the attention, shook the offered hand. "Just doing our job, Captain. Looking out for you boys." Harker shook his head. "Intelligence pieced it together from multiple reports. What you did went way beyond the job description. You risked everything on a crazy gamble that saved 93 lives. We won't forget it." Before Blackwood could respond, a staff car pulled up and Colonel Jones emerged. "Lieutenants Blackwood and Donovan, my office. Now." The assembled bomber crewmen fell silent as the fighter pilots followed their commander. Whatever gratitude the bomber crews felt, military discipline still had to be maintained. In the privacy of his office, Colonel Jones faced the two pilots across his desk, his expression unreadable. "I've spent 3 days reviewing reports and regulations," he began without preamble. "What you did violated at least 9 different protocols for combat operations. You abandoned your assigned position, misused aircraft systems, and directly disobeyed orders." He paused, his stern expression unchanging. "You also saved nearly 100 men and a 12 aircraft that, by all tactical analysis, should have been shot down over Germany." The colonel stood and walked to his window, looking out at the aircraft parked on the hard stands. "The official report will state that you executed an alternative defensive maneuver that effectively neutralized enemy fighter threat to damaged bomber elements returning from Target D. There will be no mention of fuel dumping, disobeying orders, or any other irregular tactics." He turned back to face them. "Unofficially, both Bomber Command and Fighter Command are very interested in your tactics. There will be a detailed debriefing with intelligence officers tomorrow. They want to understand exactly how you executed this maneuver and whether it might be applicable in other scenarios." Blackwood and Donovan exchanged a glance, uncertain whether they were being praised or set up for later punishment. "Are we being charged, sir?" Donovan finally asked. Colonel Jones's expression softened slightly. "No, Lieutenant, but neither are you being commended. What you did worked this time. It might not work again. And we can't have every fighter pilot dumping fuel and running off on private crusades, no matter how well-intentioned." He sat back down at his desk and picked up 2 folders. "You're both being assigned to different squadrons effective immediately. Lieutenant Donovan, you'll report to the 357th at Leaston. Lieutenant Blackwood, you're transferring to the 352nd at Bodney." Both pilots stiffened. Splitting them up felt like punishment regardless of the colonel's words. "This isn't disciplinary," Jones clarified, reading their expressions. "Fighter Command wants your knowledge spread more widely. You'll both be conducting informal training sessions on German fighter tactics and response options for escort missions." He closed the folders and looked directly at Blackwood. "Your understanding of aircraft systems saved lives, Lieutenant. That kind of knowledge needs to be shared. But so does the understanding that in combat, discipline and coordination usually outweigh individual initiative, no matter how brilliant." As they left the colonel's office, Blackwood felt a complex mixture of emotions: relief at avoiding court-martial, pride in the lives saved, regret at leaving his squadron, and uncertainty about what his future role would entail. "Well, that could have gone worse," Donovan offered, as they walked across the airfield. Blackwood nodded absently, his mind already calculating new tactical possibilities based on what they had learned. The fuel dump worked this time because the Germans weren't expecting it, but there are other systems that could be utilized in similar ways, other psychological angles to exploit. Donovan laughed and clapped him on the shoulder. Still the professor, even after all this. Some things never change, but things had changed. In the deadly calculus of aerial warfare, Thomas Blackwood had discovered that understanding the technical capabilities of aircraft was only the beginning. The true art lay in understanding the human psychology of the pilots who flew them, both enemy and friend. It was a lesson he would carry forward through his remaining combat missions and into the peacetime world beyond. And it was a lesson that would gradually percolate through the tactical doctrine of fighter escort operations, never officially acknowledged but passed from pilot to pilot, in ready rooms and at squadron bars. Sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't your guns, but your understanding of the complex systems, mechanical and human, that determine survival in the unforgiving arena of aerial combat. In the decades that followed, as jet engines replaced piston power and computer systems took over functions once controlled by human hands, the fundamental truth that Blackwood had discovered over Dresden remained valid. The deepest understanding of any complex system reveals not just its capabilities, but its vulnerabilities, and sometimes turning those vulnerabilities into strengths can change the mathematical odds from certain defeat to improbable victory. The fuel leak ruse, as it came to be known among the pilots who passed the story down through generations, never appeared in any official training manual or tactical handbook. But its lessons, technical knowledge, psychological insight, and moral courage became part of the unwritten curriculum that shaped the character of those who fly and fight in defense of freedom. For the men of the lucky dozen who returned to their bases that February evening in 1945, the specifics of how they had been saved remained mostly unknown. They knew only that when all tactical analysis said they should have died over Germany, something or someone had intervened to change the deadly mathematics of aerial warfare. And sometimes in the brutal arithmetic of total war, that made all the difference. The war in Europe ground to its inevitable conclusion less than 3 months after the Dresden mission. Germany's cities lay in ruins, its industry shattered, its population exhausted by years of warfare and deprivation. The Third Reich that had boasted of a 1,000-year dominion collapsed into unconditional surrender after 12 years of murderous rule. For the airmen who had participated in the strategic bombing campaign, emotions were mixed. Pride in victory mingled with horror at the destruction they had wrought, and grief for the comrades who hadn't lived to see the peace. They had done their duty, followed their orders, and survived when thousands of others had not. Now they faced the challenge of returning to civilian lives forever altered by what they had experienced 5 miles above the earth. Thomas Blackwood flew 17 more combat missions before VE Day, each time applying the lessons of technical understanding and tactical flexibility that had served him so well over Dresden. He never again needed to employ the fuel dump deception. The circumstances and opportunity never aligned in the same way, but the reputation of the professor grew with each successful mission. By war's end, he had been promoted to captain and received the Distinguished Flying Cross for extraordinary achievement in aerial combat. The citation made no specific mention of the Dresden incident, but those who knew the story recognized its influence on his subsequent tactical innovations. In June of 1945, as the massive machinery of military demobilization began processing millions of American servicemen for return to civilian life, Blackwood received unexpected orders to report to Wright Field in Ohio rather than to a separation center. There, he was offered a position with a newly formed Air Technical Intelligence Unit tasked with evaluating captured German aircraft and developing tactics for what military planners already recognized would be the next generation of aerial warfare. Your combination of engineering background and combat experience is exactly what we need, explained Colonel Harrison Markham, the unit's commander. The Germans were developing jet fighters, flying wings, guided missiles, technology that's years ahead of our current tactical doctrine. We need people who can understand both the technical systems and their combat applications. Blackwood accepted the position and spent the next 3 years testing captured German aircraft and developing tactical manuals for the fledgling United States Air Force. His experience with the fuel dump deception influenced his approach to these new technologies, always seeking the unexpected application, the psychological edge, the creative solution that might transform disadvantage into advantage. In 1948, with the Cold War intensifying and military aviation entering the jet age, Blackwood left active service and returned to Oklahoma to complete his engineering degree. He joined an aerospace firm developing control systems for the new generation of fighter aircraft, bringing his unique perspective as both engineer and combat pilot to the design process. Throughout his professional career, he maintained contact with several members of the Lucky Dozen. Each year on February 15th, he received cards or phone calls from bomber crewmen who had never forgotten their miraculous deliverance. Captain James Harker, who went on to become an airline pilot after the war, made a particular point of meeting Blackwood whenever their travels brought them to the same city. "You know what still amazes me?" Harker said during one such reunion in 1962. Not just that you came up with such an insane plan on the spur of the moment, but that you understood the Germans well enough to know it would work. You didn't just outfly them, you outthought them. Blackwood, characteristically modest, deflected the praise. I just applied what I knew about aircraft systems and human psychology. Any pilot with the same knowledge would have done the same. No, Harker insisted. They wouldn't. Most of us used our planes like tools, point, shoot, follow procedures. You understood yours like it was part of you. That made all the difference. As aviation technology advanced through the jet age and into the era of supersonic flight and computerized systems, Blackwood remained active as a consultant, always advocating for designs that gave pilots the maximum understanding of and control over their aircraft. He argued against black box systems that functioned without pilot comprehension, insisting that in combat, knowledge was often the decisive factor. A pilot who merely operates an aircraft can only do what the designers anticipated, he wrote in a 1975 technical paper. A pilot who truly understands the aircraft can improvise solutions the designers never imagined. In the chaos of combat, that understanding often makes the difference between victory and defeat, between life and death. When interviewed in his later years about his wartime experiences, Blackwood typically downplayed his role in the Dresden incident, preferring to discuss the broader strategic implications of the air campaign or the technical evolution of fighter aircraft. But occasionally, with the right questioner, he would elaborate on the thinking that had led to his unorthodox solution. War is fundamentally about human decisions made under extreme stress, he explained to a military historian in 1988. Understanding the machinery is important, but understanding the people operating that machinery is crucial. The Germans were excellent pilots flying excellent aircraft, but they were operating under constraints, limited fuel, intense pressure to score victories, rigid tactical doctrine. Once I recognized those constraints, I could use their strengths against them. Thomas Blackwood died in 2004 at the age of 82, leaving behind 3 children, 7 grandchildren, and a legacy that extended far beyond his immediate family. His technical papers on aircraft systems and combat tactics continued to be studied at the Air Force Academy. His innovations in control system design influenced multiple generations of fighter aircraft, and his story, officially unacknowledged but widely known within the fighter pilot community, inspired a tradition of creative problem-solving that valued deep technical understanding over mere procedural compliance. Among his personal effects was a small wooden box containing a vial of aviation fuel and a handwritten note. A small price for 12 bombers, February 15, 1945. Alongside it lay a faded photograph of 12 B-17 crews standing beneath their aircraft, men who had lived full lives because one pilot understood that in war, as in engineering, the most elegant solutions often arise from the deepest understanding of the systems involved. In a world increasingly dominated by automated systems and artificial intelligence, the lesson of Thomas Blackwood's improvisation takes on renewed significance. The most sophisticated technology is only as effective as the human understanding that guides its application. In critical moments, the difference between disaster and triumph often hinges not on having the most advanced equipment, but on having the deepest comprehension of how that equipment works and the courage to use that knowledge in unexpected ways. As new generations of pilots take to the skies in aircraft of ever-increasing complexity, the story of the fuel leak ruse serves as a reminder that behind all the sophisticated technology, the fundamental elements of aerial combat remain unchanged. Understand your aircraft, understand your opponent, and never stop calculating the mathematics of survival. Would you have broken the order or obeyed it? Would you have risked court-martial and your own life to save others through an unauthorized tactical innovation? Would you have had the technical knowledge to even conceive of such a solution in the chaos of combat? These questions have no easy answers, then or now. They remind us that courage takes many forms: from the physical bravery of facing enemy fire to the moral courage of defying authority when lives hang in the balance, to the intellectual courage of pursuing understanding beyond what regulations require. Thomas Blackwood's story is not just about a clever aerial tactic, it's about the responsibility that comes with technical knowledge and the obligation to use that knowledge in service of something greater than oneself. It's a reminder that in our increasingly technological world, understanding the systems we create and control is not merely a practical necessity, but a moral imperative. Share this story so others remember what courage really means. Not just the courage to face danger, but the courage to think beyond conventional solutions when lives are at stake. In a world increasingly dominated by protocols and algorithms, we need more Thomas Blackwoods, willing to understand systems deeply enough to recognize when the rules must be bent to serve their ultimate purpose. Comment below and tell us, what would you have done in Lieutenant Blackwood's place?